Russia's secret weapon to dodge sanctions has just been exposed, and Germany delivered the blow. It's a move that could shake up global oil trade, tighten the noose on Putin's war funding, and send ripples through NATO's entire strategy in the Baltic. The world's eyes are now on a fleet that was never meant to be seen, and what just happened may be the beginning of its unraveling. So what is this shadow fleet? Why has it been untouchable until now? And what does this mean for the war in Ukraine? Stick around, we're breaking it all down in today's episode of The Military Show. First, let's start with the details of the actual confiscation, which put everything here in motion. To be honest, the entire operation seems to be a complete accident, albeit an extremely fortunate one. According to a report from Reuters and other news outlets, the oil cargo ship apparently lost engine power and was found adrift somewhere around the Baltic Sea island of Rügen. Whether the ship transmitted an SOS signal, which was intercepted by the German authorities, or if it was simply found with its engines malfunctioning hasn't yet been clarified. Regardless, the German administration decided not to look a gift horse in its mouth and immediately enacted a previous confiscation order for the vessel. The Reuters report suggested that the vessel could hold as much as 100,000 metric tons of oil, which would be worth roughly $43 million on the market. This is a huge financial loss for Russia and also limits its ability to transport oil to its various trading partners as part of its efforts to dodge the sanctions imposed by the West. The vessel, which was flying under the Panama flag and was named Evasion, is considered to be one of many Russian ships that operate within its oil shadow fleet. But how does this fleet operate? First, it requires Russia to have a healthy supply of cargo vessels. Fortunately for them, Russia has one of the biggest merchant navies in the world. A 2023 estimate by the Wisconsin Project suggested that Russia had 976 general cargo ships and 387 dedicated oil tankers, as well as over 1,500 other ships to meet the country's various trade demands. However, not all of the tankers were suitable for these fleet operations. Typically, a tanker would need to be relatively old, with its make and model closely matching ships that could be found in any other nation's merchant navies. Next, Russia uses a flag of convenience to hide the true ownership of the vessel it's using. The shadow countries chosen typically have a few things in common. They are often smaller countries with very little oversight and presence on the international stage, which makes it easier for them to slip by common regulatory practices imposed by other countries, in this case, the West. Essentially, Russia uses its own ships, puts a different flag on it, likely even gives it a new name more befitting of the country of the flag's origin, and then uses it to transport cargo from its ports to anywhere in the world. And the ships don't even have to come from Russia. According to commodity trading firm Trafigura, approximately 600 tankers were covertly transporting Russian oil and petroleum products by February 2023. By December of that same year, this number had reportedly increased to 1,089 vessels. At that point, around 75% of the global shadow fleet was involved in shipping Russian oil, with 66% exclusively handling exports from Russia. Maritime analytics experts further estimate that these shadow vessels represented about 18% of total global oil shipments at the time. The discrepancy in vessel numbers surely didn't come from Russia producing new vessels, which would go against the policy of using old vessels with minimal insurance, which we'll discuss shortly. Instead, Russia started buying up foreign ships and putting entirely different flags on them to further confound Western authorities. Another hallmark tactic employed by the Shadow Fleet, which was likely used in the Evasion's case as well, is the use of ship-to-ship oil transfers at sea. These transfers typically occur in international waters, especially near Greece, Malaysia, or the Gulf of Finland. This allows Russia to hide the trail of the ships and allows it to easily change ownership without the proper paper trail of conventional shipping. By offloading oil onto other vessels mid-ocean, operators effectively erase or disguise the cargo's origin, enabling sanctioned Russian crude oil to re-enter global markets under false pretenses. Although the Evasion's specific transfers remain undisclosed, such practices are routine within the fleet. How is this done? Well, all maritime vessels are subject to international standards maintained by the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, including displaying a unique IMO number, registering and flagging by a specific country, following regulations governing ship-to-ship or SDS transfers, and using the Automatic Identification System, also known as AIS, which indicates a ship's location. The IMO also requires tankers to carry liability insurance against oil spills and other possible accidents, with the insurance premiums set by classification societies. However, Shadow Fleet vessels regularly disable their AIS, intentionally going dark to evade detection by maritime enforcement authorities. The Evasion almost certainly engaged in this practice, turning off tracking devices to obscure its routes and evade monitoring by Western governments. This tactic complicates the efforts of regulators attempting to intercept or monitor sanction-evading activities, allowing these vessels significant operational flexibility. Therefore, it's likely that the confiscation performed by the German authorities occurred almost entirely by pure happenstance. If the ship's engines hadn't failed and the ship slowly veered off course into waters more closely monitored by German authorities, it's far more likely that another tanker or a maintenance vessel would have been able to catch up to it, fix the problem, and allow it to resume its shipping route. Furthermore, shadow fleets typically rely on non-Western insurance firms, often based in Russia, India, China, or jurisdictions that do not strictly adhere to international sanctions. These insurers provide nominal coverage that allows vessels like the Eventine to maintain the illusion of compliance with maritime standards. However, their insurers rarely offer coverage robust enough to address genuine maritime risks. This is another reason why the Russian shadow fleet is typically composed of older and less well-maintained ships. If something was to happen to a ship, the losses could be minimized by spending as little money on overheads and insurance costs. It's also likely that the very reason the ship's engines malfunctioned was due to the negligence imposed by the lack of high-quality insurance. This highlights a few big issues for Russia. First, the scale of the Russian shadow fleet operations makes it a practically indispensable resource for Russia. What's particularly frustrating for Western policymakers is how effectively this strategy neutralized their sanctions. After an initial economic shock that saw Russian oil revenues plummet by over 40% in early 2023, the shadow fleet enabled a remarkable recovery. Russia's economy actually grew by 4.1% in 2023, defying predictions of collapse. The oil kept flowing, just through different channels and to different destinations. In fact, Russia's economy was estimated to have only shrunk by 1.2% in 2022, the year of the invasion and when the sanctions first hit. Additionally, the country was one of the few in the world to have a negligible loss during the 2020-2021 COVID pandemic, unlike pretty much every NATO member in Europe. Multiple succeeding years of economic balancing have allowed Russia to practically benefit from being in the war in the first place. Despite the initial economic sanctions, Russia has found new key trading partners, particularly within the BRICS. This meant that the country's biggest trading partners shifted from China, Turkey, and the Netherlands to China, India, and Turkey. This was in large part due to most of Europe weaning itself off Russian oil and gas. Pre-war, Europe imported over 80% of its natural gas, and almost half of that, 40%, came from Russia alone. By the end of 2022, only 9% of European gas came from the Russian supply, with countries like the US and Norway stepping in to become major suppliers. This directly led to Russia managing to offload the sanctions by promoting trade with the few countries that didn't implement any, namely China and India. These two countries ended up accounting for a majority of Russia's trade. It's estimated that 2/3 of the oil that previously went to the EU was rerouted to India after the sanctions. This trading volume fell slightly after the West imposed another round of sanctions in early 2024, but it remains a steady source of oil for India and money for Russia. And the shadow fleet is a significant part of why this is allowed to happen. With trading vessels being able to go unimpeded across seas and oceans, Russia has managed to evade Western sanctions, grow its economy, and ultimately fund the very war that started all of this. Case in point, it was estimated that Russia earned 28% of its total revenue from exporting gas and oil to other countries in 2022. Figures from 2023 suggested a slightly lower dependency of around 25%. Even with the increased diversification, that's still a quarter of the country's economy being run on the oil and gas industry. But that's exactly why the successful German confiscation of the shadow oil tanker is vital to undermining the Russian economy. If the West can replicate this with more Russian vessels, it can deal a devastating blow to Russia's ability to wage war. In 2025, Russia's approved budget totals approximately 41.5 trillion rubles, around $435.7 billion, marking one of the largest fiscal plans in recent history. Of particular note is the allocation for national defense, which reaches 13.5 trillion rubles, nearly $142 billion, a notable 25% increase compared to the previous year. This allocation accounts for roughly 32.5% of the total federal spending, underscoring the Kremlin's emphasis on military readiness amid ongoing geopolitical tensions and the conflict in Ukraine. Additionally, national security and law enforcement receive considerable resources, with funding set at 3.5 trillion rubles or $36.7 billion. Combined, national defense, security, and law enforcement expenditures constitute approximately 41% of Russia's entire federal budget, emphasizing the priority Moscow places on security matters. Furthermore, nearly 1/3 of the 2025 budget is classified as secret or top secret. This strategic shift toward heightened military preparedness, amplified secrecy, and increased taxation are measures indicative of the Kremlin's broader political and military objectives amidst the ongoing conflict and international pressures. It's also worth noting that the authorities seem to be downplaying the budget's strong military focus. Key officials haven't mentioned it, and Russian business publications aren't covering it extensively. This essentially doubles up on the secrecy involved in the process. More importantly, it shows that the Kremlin is continuing its propaganda about the war, which so far has involved showing that the country is clearly winning the war and that there's no reason to worry. Some countries have also noted that the Russian shadow fleet is a potential danger to the environment and global security. Estonia is positioned at the forefront of maritime security challenges due to its close geographic proximity to Russia along the Gulf of Finland, at the eastern end of the Baltic Sea. Commercial vessels and oil tankers in the Gulf primarily travel east to west, transporting goods from major Russian ports such as Primorsk, the Baltic Sea's largest hub for oil shipments. Conversely, passenger ships operating within the EU carry approximately 10 million travelers per year and move predominantly north to south, significantly increasing the potential for maritime collisions. The presence of Russian ships anchored in Estonia's exclusive economic zone, typically awaiting entry into Russian ports, has raised concerns about possible environmental harm if an oil spill occurs. Some of these vessels remain stationary for days, while others may await entry for several months. Last summer, Estonian authorities requested insurance documentation from approximately 200 anchored ships voluntarily, receiving responses from only 2/3 of them. According to Mari-Liis Sepp of the Sanctions and Strategic Export Control Department of the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, these ships present an environmental risk since they anchor very near our coastline, and even those with insurance may not have dependable coverage. This speaks of the aforementioned practice of using insurance that is subpar for Western standards. In Russia's case, the Estonian Foreign Affairs Ministry noted that some of the new insurance carriers come from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, two famously landlocked countries that were once part of the Soviet Union. Furthermore, Russia maintains a close relationship with these countries by propping up their governments, going so far as to deploy its military to break up violent protests in Kazakhstan in 2022. The combination of hiding their identity, turning off their broadcast identifiers, and using old vessels with insufficient insurance and likely subpar maintenance practices means that the Russian shadow fleet is one of the most volatile and dangerous aspects of the naval trade at the moment. Because they account for nearly a fifth of naval trade, they represent a substantial number of ships going under the radar, which can significantly endanger vessels traveling within the legal and correct framework. Furthermore, these ships are transporting crude oil, a fossil fuel that's extremely hazardous to the environment. A major oil spill or accident involving a shadow tanker could trigger international outrage and lead to broader crackdowns, potentially even from neutral or non-aligned countries. That would threaten Russia's ability to maintain a large portion of its export infrastructure. There's also the legal and reputational risk associated with the shadow fleet. Several vessels linked to Russia have been suspected of damaging undersea infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, such as communication cables and pipelines, raising concerns about possible acts of sabotage. On January 14th, NATO member states from the Baltic region convened to discuss measures aimed at mitigating these threats. NATO subsequently announced plans to deploy frigates, patrol aircraft, and naval drones to protect critical infrastructure under the initiative known as Baltic Sentry. Furthermore, in late December, the Russian-linked oil tanker Eagle S was implicated in damage to submerged cables connecting Estonia and Finland. In January, Swedish officials detained a Malta-flagged tanker involved in damaging an undersea cable between Sweden and Latvia. Another vessel believed to have participated in the same event was seized by Norway on January 31st. Whether intentional or accidental, such incidents increase Russia's exposure to legal action, international condemnation, and retaliatory measures. They also give NATO countries justification to increase patrols and surveillance in key maritime zones, putting further pressure on Russia's covert maritime operations. In essence, Russia's shadow fleet is under increasing pressure from the West, largely due to happenstance. The fleet of old and aging ships with little to no maintenance that tries to avoid the Western radar means that Russia actually has very little control over the process, despite needing those same logistics for funding the war. And that's why Germany managing to seize the Eventine is potentially a big deal. It underscores that Russia doesn't have the capacity to properly track and maintain these ships, even remotely away from its ports. While this undoubtedly only increases the potential risk to the environment, it also means that Russian vessels could lose the relative invisibility they rely on to conduct covert trade. Combined with the aforementioned focus on military and national defense, at least in terms of budget, Russia is slowly losing steam in the war. Russia's decision to funnel an outsized portion of its resources into military spending and war efforts is creating conditions for long-term economic and industrial decline throughout the country. While the shadow fleet has temporarily propped up oil revenues, the fundamental reorientation of the Russian economy toward military priorities is causing significant structural damage. This massive military focus that takes up more than a third of the country's yearly budget is starving other critical sectors that need investment and creating multiple pathways to decline. First, there's the brain drain problem. Russia has experienced an unprecedented exodus of educated professionals since the war began. Conservative estimates suggest over 900,000 people have fled the country, most of those being skilled workers such as software engineers, academics, medical professionals, and financial experts. These are precisely the people needed to develop a modern, diversified economy. Their departure, which is implied to be permanent in an overwhelming number of cases, leaves Russia increasingly dependent on extractive industries like oil and gas rather than developing new economic sectors. Infrastructure investment has also collapsed outside the defense sector. Roads, bridges, power plants, and telecommunications networks are receiving minimal maintenance as funds are diverted to tanks and missiles. This deteriorating infrastructure will hamper economic growth for decades to come, as transportation costs rise and basic services become less reliable. This is compounded by Ukraine focusing its efforts on using long-range missiles and drones to target vital logistics infrastructure close to its borders. The education and healthcare systems are similarly suffering. University budgets have been slashed, research programs shuttered, and medical facilities are struggling with reduced funding and staff shortages. These cuts have immediate impacts on quality of life, but also represent a devastating blow to Russia's future human capital development. Perhaps most concerning for Russia's long-term prospects is the innovation deficit. Military production emphasizes standardization and mass manufacturing of existing designs rather than developing new technologies or improving productivity. While defense contractors are thriving, civilian manufacturing and technology development are withering. Russia is falling further behind global technology curves in sectors like renewable energy, advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and biotechnology, the very industries that will drive economic growth in the coming decades. Foreign direct investment in non-energy sectors has virtually disappeared. International companies that might bring new technologies and management practices have exited the market, leaving Russia increasingly isolated from global innovation networks. This isolation is compounded by export controls that prevent access to advanced components and technologies. Russia's consumer economy is suffering as well. Real wages have declined substantially when adjusted for inflation, and many imported consumer goods have disappeared from shelves. The average Russian citizen is experiencing a steadily declining standard of living, with fewer economic opportunities outside the military-industrial complex. Historical parallels suggest that Russia could be following the same path that ultimately led to the Soviet Union's economic collapse. Like the USSR, today's Russia is sacrificing civilian economic development to maintain military spending levels that its economy simply won't be able to sustain long-term. The Shadow Fleet and other sanction evasion measures have bought time, but they aren't solving the fundamental imbalance of an economy increasingly oriented around military production rather than sustainable growth and development. Unless Russia shifts course dramatically, what we're witnessing is the slow-motion transformation of what could be a diversified, modern economy into a hollowed-out military state with declining industrial capacity, technological capability, and standard of living for its citizens. The economic damage being inflicted now will take decades to reverse, even if the war ends tomorrow. And with the pressure from the West increasing, especially to force Russia into a ceasefire, if not an outright peace agreement, it's likely only a matter of time before other Shadow Fleet vessels start popping up in news reports. While Russia might have more than 1,000 ships operating in its shadow trade, every vessel it loses directly throws another wrench into Putin's plans and economy. But what do you think? Will the Shadow Fleet get dismantled and cause the war to ultimately end? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out UK nuclear sub surfaces near Russian spy ship, then this happened. Or click this other video instead.